Hello and welcome to Podcast.init, the podcast about Python and the people who make it great. When you're ready to launch your next app or want to try a project you hear about on the show, you'll need somewhere to deploy it, so take a look at our friends over at Linode. With the launch of their managed Kubernetes platform, it's easy to get started with the next generation of deployment and scaling, powered by the battle-tested Linode platform, including simple pricing, node balancers, 40 gigabit networking, dedicated CPU and GPU instances, and worldwide data centers. Go to pythonpodcast.com/linode, that's Linode, today and get a $100 credit to try out a Kubernetes cluster of your own. And don't forget to thank them for their continued support of this show. And do you want to get better at Python? Now is an excellent time to take an online course. Whether you're just learning Python or you're looking for deep dives on topics like APIs, memory management, async and await, and more, our friends at Talk Python Training have a top-notch course for you. If you're just getting started, be sure to check out the Python for Absolute Beginners course. It's like the first year of computer science that you never took, compressed into 10 fun hours of Python coding and problem solving. Go to pythonpodcast.com/talkpython today and get 10% off the course that will help you find your next level. That's pythonpodcast.com/talkpython, and don't forget to thank them for supporting the show. Your host, as usual, is Tobias Macey, and today I'm interviewing Jake Lumetta about Butter CMS and the role of a headless CMS in the modern web ecosystem. So, Jake, can you start by introducing yourself?
Yeah, my name is Jake Lumetta. I'm the founder and CEO of Butter CMS.
And do you remember how you first got introduced to Python?
Quite a while ago at this point. I had started in PHP, kind of dabbling in the web back in middle school, kind of early high school days. I started with a friend who introduced me to Python and Django simultaneously, and also kind of the MVC concept, framework concept, model view controller concept. And compared to PHP, I love the syntax of Python. PHP, at least the PHP that I wrote, inherently it has, dollar signs and semicolons kind of all over the place. And not being very good at PHP, mine was certainly littered with those. So when I saw the syntax of Python, it was just like, wow, this is really clean and nice. And it just sort of felt like a nice kind of logical way to write code. So I was drawn to it by that.
Before we get too far into Butter CMS specifically, can you start by giving a bit of an overview about what a headless CMS is and how the use case and user experience differ for that as compared to traditional CMS such as WordPress?
So the term headless CMS is kind of a weird term, admittedly. Certainly when I started Butter, I didn't call it a headless CMS. I didn't even know what a headless CMS was. I never heard of the concept. I thought of Butter as what it is sort of at a technical basis, which is an API-first CMS, meaning it's sort of an API-first approach. So there's really two parts to like a headless CMS. One is the API, so the content API, which is what the companies, developers will query content from, is the content API. And they pull that content into their own native application built in any tech stack that they want. And then the other piece is, of course, the content dashboard, which is where the marketers go in and actually, marketers, clients, whoever, they go and actually manage the content. So it's the easy to use kind of friendly dashboard. You can actually go create the actual blog posts or landing pages and that kind of thing, upload images, do all that kind of stuff. And you don't need to be technical to do it. So that's sort of what I have the CMS is at a very high level. It's really like the content API or set of APIs, as well as the content editing dashboard itself. Yeah, and so as far as the use case and user experience and how it compares to a traditional CMS like WordPress, so on the marketer side, on the surface, it is somewhat of a similar experience to WordPress in the sense that, the goal of it really is to provide the marketer a really easy to use UI. They don't need to be technical to use it, to update content and do their jobs. And WordPress does this pretty well, generally speaking. Certainly, that's why it's so popular. On the dev side, though, is where things change. And it's really kind of a night and day difference. So with a headless CMS like with Butter, you get to work with any tech stack. You get to work with the one that you're most proficient with. So, if you prefer to work with Django and Python, you can start there and you build out your own application, marketing website using Django. And then you plug CMS capability into that. So you plug, the content API into your own kind of native stack. And with WordPress on the dev side, of course, this WordPress flips this on you completely. So you don't get to start with, again, assuming you're a developer who prefers Django in this example, if you want to use WordPress, you basically abandon Django altogether, right? You got to dive into the WordPress world. So you start with WordPress, you start with it as a sort of complete stack. You need to master its terminology, how it works, the internals of it, its code base, database schema, of course, diving into PHP, since that's what it's built in. So you really go, from there and kind of start hacking and slashing WordPress to customize it to do and behave the way you want it to. So it's very different approaches, very different experiences on the development side.
Another interesting way to think about the use cases for a headless CMS is, as you mentioned, you're able to use your tech stack that you prefer. But if you're already using something like Django, then what is the benefit of a headless CMS versus integrating a framework such as Django CMS or Wagtail into your existing site for being able to manage that content and have it very tightly integrated with the overall application that you're building?
Django CMS, Wagtail, these are what I kind of think of as like traditional CMSs. Every language and framework has these, where they're very often, open source CMSs built in, a particular native language, Django, Ruby on Rails, etc. And they're very similar to WordPress in the sense that, they are large pieces of software, or maybe not large all the time, but, they're pieces of software that you need to own. So you need to install it, you need to host it and run it, you need to maintain it. So you need to patch it and ensure that it stays secure and up to date. And you need to customize it. And in order to customize it, if you need to customize it beyond sort of its native capabilities or, its native API, then you need to dive into like the guts of how it works. So, those are some of the drawbacks with their traditional CMS is they are quite software heavy, as opposed to Headless CMS, where in terms of software to adopt the Headless CMS, it's very, very light software-wise. So all you're really doing is you're querying the content API, which returns just the raw content for, let's say, a blog post. You query the content API and it returns like the text values and the images for that piece of content, for that blog post. You can think of it in a way as instead of like querying your own database with a table of blog posts, you're querying that same data from an API, basically. It's a very lightweight approach to get fully functional CMS capability. And in our case with Butter, there's certainly open source headless CMSs. And for those, you need to host and maintain them and all that kind of stuff comes into play again if you go that approach. With Butter, we've decided to be sort of SaaS only. And so we handle all of the infrastructure and security and updating and that kind of thing. So that's some of the assumptions that I'm making when I'm describing this.
Can you dig a bit more into what you've built at Butter CMS and what motivated you to build a business around this particular problem area?
Kind of the origin of Butter ties back in nicely to WordPress, honestly. So at previous companies, I led engineering at a couple other startups, and those startups actually were built, the primary technology stack was Django. So the business was sort of like an online marketplace for energy. So the business was the website. That was the case. And so we had this custom marketplace built out in Django. And the marketing team came along one day. This is in my mind, of course, the developer's perspective. So everything's happy. And then one day the marketing team comes along and they say, hey, we need to do our jobs. And we need to be able to, write blog posts. And so we need a blog for our site. It's like, okay, well, the first time around, I said, let's just go with WordPress because it's WordPress and that's what everyone kind of does. And so that was my first foray personally into trying to get WordPress to work with the existing Django site. And at the time, I didn't have deep experience with WordPress, so ended up trying to find a WordPress consultant developer to help kind of build this out. And they were a very capable developer, but even with that, it still took a really long time to just get it to work, to honestly just to add a blog to our existing site. I felt like should have been really, really trivial. Now, I should note that we didn't just go kind of the subdomain approach where you just do like blog.mysite.com. We wanted it to live within the main domain of the site. We wanted, mysite.com/blog, which is better for SEO purposes. And so when you start doing that route, you get into the complexities of like URL routing and how the Django URL routing meshes and plays nicely with the WordPress routing and like who should own what part of the routing structure and that kind of thing. So anyways, it ended up being a really long, kind of painful process, quite expensive. And then the final product, again, I was not experienced in WordPress personally. So we had outsourced the development of the WordPress blog, but now we, of course, had the problem of, I guess I had the problem of how to maintain this thing. So anytime bugs came up or a security patch needed to get applied, that was on me to kind of own that and figure it out. So that was kind of a painful process. And then that company got acquired into a larger company who did the same thing. And it was literally a case of deja vu. We went through the same experience. Also built in Django, and we needed a CMS. We needed to add CMS to the site. And that time around, I had learned from the first attempt at this. And so I kind of advocated internally, like, we should not go the WordPress route. And kind of going back to one of your previous questions, we tried one of the open source, I forget which, it was not Django CMS, but it was another CMS like that. It was an open source kind of free CMS. And we tried to plug it into our Django stack. And it was cool from a developer perspective. And this also ties back to the question here of like, what was my motivation for starting Butter? So we used like an open source Django built CMS. And from the dev side, it was like, this is cool. Like, this is designed to plug into our existing site, the Django site. But then on the marketer side, the editing experience was left much to be desired. It was really kind of clunky, hard to use. And there were still a lot of kind of problems that we had to solve as far as like, making a nice experience to upload an image and like serving that image from a CDN, and like all that kind of stuff. So we lost that battle with the marketing team. And eventually we ended up going down the WordPress route again. Yeah. So that was kind of the origin story. It was like, I sort of reflected back on the experience and said, like, there's got to be a better way to do this. There's got to be a better, easier way. The marketers get an interface like the dashboard that they love to use, just like the WordPress one. It's easy to use. But developers also get the optimal experience of getting to use the technologies that they prefer, that they're most proficient with, and being able to plug CMS right into those, like right into that tech stack, whatever it is. So that was really the motivation. It's like, from a developer perspective, what would be an optimal way for CMS to work for both developers to get it integrated quickly, as well as for marketers to have a great experience managing content.
And another use case for having the CMS be an external service to the application is that if you happen to have multiple products, then it makes it easier to be able to use the one service across those different applications and be able to potentially reuse content, either just image assets or repurpose blog posts, or reuse at least the general framework for landing pages and things like that.
Yeah, and that's a great point. And that's actually one of the strongest potentially, arguments for headless CMS is that, so the term headless, to kind of speak on that, is, I never learned this in computer science, but apparently head refers to sort of the presentation layer of an app. In any case, that's what headless CMS means. It means basically the CMS system is focused on sort of the raw content, and that content can get pulled into any and many front-end systems to present it, right? So you could have, to your point, you have blog post content. You might have a desktop website that displays that content in a nice presentation for desktop. And maybe that's built on React, maybe it's built on Ruby on Rails, maybe it's built on Django. And you can also have a native mobile app, for your company that also displays that exact same content. And because Headless CMS doesn't control the presentation, it doesn't control the front end, it just serves up the raw content. You could build that mobile app to then display that exact same content in a really friendly way for that platform, for that medium. So that's really powerful when you get into, again, as you mentioned, like reusing and repurposing content. So in Butter, you sort of have these it's more of like a kind of a logical approach. Like you organize and structure your content in a more logical fashion and sort of a more normalized fashion. It's more of kind of like a data modeling exercise. And when you think about it that way, of like, how do you actually set up content in a clean, normalized way? And that allows you to very easily repurpose it and reuse it in as many different places as you want, which is quite powerful.
To the point of treating it as a data modeling exercise, and because of the fact that a lot of the people who are interacting primarily with the actual content creation side of things don't necessarily have as much of a background in the technical aspects of doing things like data modeling or understanding the right abstraction layers, how do you approach the challenge of exposing some of those concepts to the marketers or to the content creators who are using Butter CMS for being able to create this information and make it reusable or remixable for being able to either use it across multiple platforms or have core pieces of information that they're able to then plug into different representations or different, timelines for being able to republish content?
It really goes into just kind of more disciplined upfront planning of how the content is going to be used, what content needs to be managed, where it's going to be displayed and presented. So in the case of Butter, we have a concept called components. And components are really meant to represent or sort of map logically very nicely to kind of the UI for your site. So you can decompose your homepage of your website, for example, or some of the interfaces of your mobile app into these components. So an example of a component would be image carousel. Another one might be, like a banner. Another one might be a call to action with a headline and a button or something like that. So you can sort of, as a team between the developers and the marketers, you come up with a common language to say like, okay, what are sort of like the set of components that we want to provide to the marketing team so that they can go do their jobs completely independent of developers. And so that's kind of how things play out. So in the beginning, again, marketers and developers collaborate and say, like, what's this library of components that we really should be focused on creating? And then developers, designers to go and implement that, and then hand it over to the marketing team. And the marketers are then completely empowered to, compose content using those set of components in any order, in any fashion that they want. So it gives them a lot of flexibility to create dynamic landing pages, blog posts, that kind of thing.
In terms of the overall scope of the ecosystem for CMS platforms, both open source and commercial, how do you view the current state of affairs, and what is your perspective on the way that Butter CMS fits within that overall space?
In terms of CMS, there's a lot. It's quite robust. Certainly, CMS is not new. There's a lot of options to choose from, spanning industries, use cases, company sizes. So there's massive enterprise CMSs. There's small, free, open source, super lightweight CMSs. There's so many options to choose from. So my one thing would be just, pleading, like, please do not build your own CMS if that's not like what your core business is doing. Like, there's just a lot of options out there. So if you can avoid it, try avoid building a CMS and then just use anyone internally. So we've spoken to some companies who, maybe have a legacy CMS that they built 15 years ago or something like that. And they're sort of taking a step back and looking at, how much time is our development team spending maintaining this thing? How happy is our marketing team with it? When you build your own CMS, it is trivial. It's like, okay, let's just build a CMS to manage blog posts. And it seems very trivial, but to build a great experience for the marketers, and by great experience, I mean, just intuitive, where they can just do the simplest things that they would expect to be able to do: upload images, resize images, have those images serve from a CDN, embed videos, all that kind of stuff. It adds up over time, and so it may not be obvious in the very outset, to create like a blog post CMS, for example, but it does get quite complex. And so we've seen a lot of companies kind of over time say, hey, first of all, the experience that we built, because it isn't our core business, like you can't justify spending time maintaining the CMS and improving it. Like, that's not your core business. Have just said, what, we're just going to hand it over and we're going to migrate over to Butter and kind of let you guys sort of manage it.
In terms of the overall state of the ecosystem for web development, what do you see as being the driving forces that have made the headless CMS become sort of the default approach these days, where the traditional CMS was very popular in the early to mid 2000s, and in the past at least couple of years, I've seen a lot more movement towards the headless approach to CMSs, but also a number of other back-end systems.
Have you heard of the term Jamstack?
Yes.
So there's a lot of marketing around Jamstack, and it seems like it's getting a lot of popularity. It's certainly a new kind of novel approach to building web apps. And in terms of how the CMS plays really nicely in that world, Jamstack, for those who aren't familiar, Jam is JAM, so JavaScript, APIs, and markup. So the idea is basically you have kind of no formal backend server, like running an application as you would in a Django or Rails or .NET scenario. And basically a bunch of services that provide APIs, and you have, JavaScript that queries those APIs and pulls it into a front end, being the markups of the actual presentation of it. And so there's a lot of marketing where if you are new to the space, it feels like Headless CMS is popular probably because Jamstack is also gaining popularity. And there's also these hosting platforms like Netlify, Vercel, now Cloudflare Pages. They just launched their own solution. These hosting companies effectively really kind of focus in on the Jamstack use case and statically generated websites. So it's a very whole sort of kind of new approach to building websites. I won't argue that it's necessarily or strictly better. There are certainly pros and cons. So there's a whole set of pros to having a statically generated site. And I think there's also a whole set of cons as well, as opposed to like sort of a traditional, just sort of Django, application server just running and doing things kind of the old fashioned way or whatever. So anyways, kind of going back to your question, there's a lot of marketing around this, and it feels like Jamstack, like Headless CMSs are popular because of the Jamstack. But it's funny because, as I described before, my personal pain had nothing to do with the Jamstack. I wanted to add CMS capability to a tech stack other than WordPress, honestly. And so that's why impetus for Butter. And so in my view, I feel like Headless CMSs are popular because there's more ways to build modern applications and websites than ever before. Even going back to what you might call old, like Django as a framework or Ruby on Rails. If you want to build a site using those technologies and you need to add CMS capability to it, Headless CMS is really kind of like an optimal way to do that. So that's my view on it.
In terms of the actual content that people are using CMSs for, you mentioned blog posts, you mentioned landing pages, but I'm wondering if you can dig a bit more into the types of content that are being produced and managed within these systems.
In terms of the type of content, it's been pretty cool to see sort of the diversity of industries and use cases, like the types of companies, what industries they serve, and ultimately, what kind of content they are looking to manage. And so it's been pretty cool because really, I've seen everything you can sort of imagine, from there's a hardware e-commerce company that's managing, marketing information, literally about nuts and bolts, to cryptocurrency startups, to, large healthcare systems who need to manage some customer facing kind of intranet portal content, so if the customer logs into their health portal, there's like news and updates and that kind of a thing. And they can, kind of plug Butter in to power those things. So, so the diversity has been really surprising and really cool. It's been really fun to see that. But, most commonly, if you kind of had to boil it down, it's the stuff you would expect, so it's mostly kind of marketing content, public facing content, such as blog posts, landing pages, e-commerce content, and the most common types of companies are like SaaS companies, e-commerce companies, marketplaces, and those kinds of things.
You mentioned, too, the fact that by using a headless CMS, it relieves your application development team from a particular concern within building something like a Django app or a Flask app. I'm wondering if you can talk through a bit more of the ways that people are integrating headless CMSs into their Python applications specifically.
Yeah, for sure. When I started Butter, again, just given my background in Django, the first two frameworks that I focused on were Django and Rails. When I say focused on, I mean in terms of like, which ones we should kind of formally support with an SDK. So we built out a Python SDK, which is basically just a really lightweight wrapper around our content API. Just makes it easier to actually fetch, pages and blog posts from the Butter API. In terms of actually integrating Butter into, let's go with a Django app, it's basically these three high-level steps. So the first thing, let's say you want to add a blog to your Django app that, of course, doesn't have it. So the first step is, you would add routes, just like you would for any other page. So you'd add, some blog routes to power your blog homepage and the blog post page. So you add the routes. Those routes connect to Django views, like the actual backend logic. The views are quite simple. So basically in the view, you're making an API call to fetch the blog post content. So, in the case of your blog homepage, you may be showing the 10 most recent posts as an example. So you have a route for that. You have a Django view for that. In the Django view, it makes it, kind of a one-liner API call to fetch the 10 most recent posts. And then the data comes back. The raw API returns data in a JSON format. If you're working with the Python SDK, we kind of massage that a little bit when you deserialize it, but it's really easy to work with. So the blog post structure is common attributes you would expect. It's got an author, it's got a publish date, it's got a body, etc. And then you can very often just pass that entire payload from the API, like the response, right into the template context. So you pass all that data right into the context for the template, again, in the case of Django, and then the template just sort of renders out all of those variables into the HTML and CSS to render out the full blog post.
Python has become the default language for working with data, whether as a data scientist, data engineer, data analyst, or machine learning engineer. Springboard has launched their School of Data to help you get a career in the field through a comprehensive set of programs that are 100% online and tailored to fit your busy schedule. With a network of expert mentors who are available to coach you during weekly one-on-one video calls, a tuition-back guarantee that means you don't pay until you get a job, resume preparation, and interview assistance, there's no reason to wait. Springboard is offering up to 20 scholarships of $500 towards the tuition cost, exclusively to listeners of this show. Go to pythonpodcast.com/springboard today to learn more and give your career a boost to the next level.
And digging more into Butter CMS specifically, can you talk through how the actual platform is implemented and some of the ways that the design and purpose has changed or evolved since you first began working on it?
Butter is built in Django. The most of it is built in Django. The front end, especially in our dashboard, it's evolved quite a bit over time. So we introduced Vue.js to make the dashboard a bit more responsive and just a better experience. So it's Django kind of on the back end, Django REST framework for the API, amazing API framework, Vue.js on the front end. That's kind of the core platform. And then we use a bunch of caching services and other providers. So for example, we use a service called Fastly to help with caching and serving up our API. So what that means is Fastly has a global CDN of kind of edge nodes all across the world. And whenever you quote unquote make an API call to Butter, the very first time you make the API call, it does hit our application server. We generate the JSON payload, return it back to your app. The next time you make that same API call, that full JSON payload is cached at the edge. And so you get an instant response from the Fastly server. So we use services like that to help with performance, caching, availability, response time, that kind of thing. We also use Amazon CloudFront for hosting media. So anytime you upload images into Butter, we can kind of process that image and put it into our CDN, which is powered by Amazon CloudFront, that kind of thing. But it's not overly complex. That's kind of the foundation of it. Do keep it pretty simple from that perspective. As far as how it's changed or evolved since we began working on it, performance is probably certainly the top thing. So, it's a good problem to have. We've been fortunate to kind of grow over the years. And so it's a good problem to have, but it was definitely a problem to solve in terms of performance and response times. So, when people call our API, we're looking for, sub 200 millisecond, sub 100 millisecond response times because they're loading their page based on that response. So we're looking for really fast response times. And so there's a lot of work that we've just kind of done over the years of first caching. This caching as much as we can, as often as we can, precisely as we can, kind of at all layers of the application. So I talked about Fastly, which sort of sits at the top. That's like the kind of the global CDN. And then of course, within the application itself, we have several layers of kind of memcache and that type of thing to help with response times as well. And then we've done a bunch of database query optimizations. When a request sort of makes it through all the layers of caching defense, and we actually do need to hit the database, that those queries are ideally as efficient as possible. So that's been, so performance has been one huge area. The other huge area is capability. So this is something I think probably most systems deal with, but capability in the sense of like what you can do with Butter, what are the use cases you can actually use Butter for. So in the very early days, we started off just focused on the blog use case, and over time expanded into like a fully fledged CMS where you can build landing pages and all sorts of content types and stuff like that. So, over time, our data model has gotten more complex as we've built more capability, more features, and that type of thing, and just made it a more powerful system as far as what you can actually do with it, how flexible you can actually be when using Butter.
In terms of your actual journey of going from this idea of I'm going to build a business around content management and making it easy to integrate a blogging engine into a larger application to the point where you are now, where you have a successful SaaS platform that serves as a general purpose CMS, I'm wondering if you can just talk through some of the overall journey of getting from point A to point B.
So Butter is customer funded. We've not raised any money. And the journey has been kind of slow and steady from that standpoint. So it's not the venture-backed route. by design, honestly. I had experience at venture-backed startups in my previous companies, and there's a whole, don't need to dive into that, but it's not my preferred way of building a business, running a business. The incentives and stuff like that are not really kind of aligned all the time with customers. So with Butter, decided just to take the old-fashioned approach and build a profitable customer-funded business. So the journey, yeah, honestly, day one was sort of leaving with that experience where I tried to integrate WordPress into Django and coming up with my own thoughts of like, what would an optimal way, like what would an ideal experience be? Again, speaking primarily from the developer side. Of course, the marketers need the dashboard, but like from the dev side, how would it work? And then saying like, well, would anybody pay for this? Like, would anybody pay for this? Is this even a problem that other people have? And so I was able to go from 0 to 1, and that was a huge milestone. And then when I found one person to pay for it, then the next question said, can I find 5 people to pay for this? And when I found 5 people who weren't my friends or whatever, then it just kind of kept growing from there. Can I find 10? Can I find 100? And I've just kind of tackled milestone by milestone, slowly but surely. Now we've actually got kind of a team in place and have the CMS as a thing. Again, this was not like some master plan. It was just, I didn't even know what Have the CMS was at the time. It sort of stumbled into it, and apparently Have the CMS has this kind of marketing momentum behind it. So we're Have the CMS. So we're Have the CMS now. But the origin of it has always remained true of just being a really great way to add seamless capability for developers quickly into whatever tech stack they want, and then for them to be able to hand it over to the marketing team and for the marketers to be super happy with what they provided. So yeah, it's been, feel very fortunate, and it's been a pretty awesome journey.
And in terms of actually building a content management system, as you mentioned before, at first blush, it seems like, oh, this is easy. I just add a model for being able to have text and then I render it out to the front end. But what are some of the hidden complexities that you've had to tackle and some of the areas that have been most challenging for being able to actually make a CMS that is easy and pleasant to use and something that other people want to actually give you money for?
I think most of the challenges revolve around the marketer side, like a great marketer experience. From a developer standpoint, how hard is it really to create sort of a rudimentary kind of, let's take Django or Rails, just like build out a simple database table or a Django model that represents a blog post. It's pretty trivial to figure out the schema for that. What's not trivial is building a great UI interface that layers on top of it. What's not trivial is all of the kind of edge case marketing requirements and asks that pop up over time, So like the very first data model for a blog post was, I'm trying to go back and think about some like basically the first feature requests, that came. Can blog posts have categories? Okay, sure, we added categories. Hey, can blog posts also have tags? Okay, sure, we added categories and tags. Hey, I need to be able to upload images. Okay, so we built like an image uploader file manager. Hey, I need to be able to resize images. How do I embed videos? So like just all these kind of edge case sort of marketing requests. And that's just for blog posts. When you get into actual like more complicated content modeling scenarios of like landing pages, hey, I need to build an image carousel so it can have up to 4 images, but no more than 7 images. How do I reorder the image carousel to be below the call to action on this page? Like all this kind of flexibility and capability that marketers want. And it has to be sort of intuitive and easy to use. It can't be some interface where you're like, well, you're asking the marketer to sort of manage JSON files or something like that, which is funny enough and not super uncommon sort of first stab that some companies do internally is they build out like, they literally have this sort of massive JSON file that they put together and it powers sort of the front end of their website. And then the developers ask marketers to like, hey, can you just go edit this JSON file, just edit the text or whatever to be whatever you want it to be. Of course, that means marketers actually need to like open up a text editor and make commits to this thing called GitHub. So whenever you go down that path, like marketers are not going to be happy. Anyway, so the whole marketing side is not obvious as far as really what goes into it. The other part is scaling. So if you're lucky enough where you are experiencing really great growth, you run into scaling challenges. So first and foremost, like, okay, building an image uploader, it's not rocket science, but now that image uploader should probably tie into an actual like proper CDN. So now you got to like get all your images hosted in the CDN so that your blog posts and pages load really fast so that your visitors get media served in an optimal way. If you run into other scaling challenges, like, wow, we have a lot of traffic on our site, where you're like, well, maybe we should start caching some pages. Well, if you start caching pages, you need to come up with a cache purging strategy, So there's just a whole lot of logic that can go into cache purging. You can have a kind of a sort of a lazy brute force cache purge strategy, which is like, anytime any blog post is updated, just clear the whole thing, Obviously, that's not optimal. You want to have a precise cache purging strategy to say, like, okay, if just this particular blog post was updated, like, let's only purge just the cache entries for that blog post so that we're not clearing the cache for everything else. So there's a lot of considerations that go into scaling it as well. Those would be like the two kind of big areas that I think are probably the most non-obvious when building out your own CMS.
In terms of some of the ways that you've seen it used, what are some of the most interesting or innovative or unexpected ways that you've seen the Butter CMS platform employed?
It's been really fun. So the biggest surprise is just the breadth of industries. There's the typical ones like tech startups and stuff like that. But, we've seen everyone from like law firms to healthcare to crypto startups to like real estate companies to food delivery companies, SSL vendors, gourmet pet food delivery, conference platforms. I mean, I guess it kind of literally is like any business that has a website, could theoretically have a need for a CMS. So I suppose when looking at it that way, I shouldn't be so surprised, but it's just been pretty interesting. You might assume that only super high-tech startups might use this kind of a thing, but it's not the case, at least in our experience, really at all. It's really like anyone who's using any kind of technology stack that's not WordPress and they need CMS capability, Butter really does appeal to them. And it's been pretty cool and fun. Like, it feels really awesome to be helping these companies, and it's really enjoyable, when you discover new companies that are doing something novel just by seeing, like who's signing up for Butter and like what they're working on. It's been kind of an unexpected perk or experience, what have you, kind of building Butter as a business. It's actually a way to discover other companies and like what other people are working on. So like we have lots of Y Combinator companies that have signed up for Butter. And like one recent one that came up that I thought was pretty cool is like they let you package together your dream house online. So you like go to the website, they help you like find the lot for your home. You can like pick out the interiors, and then they help you find builders to execute on it. So, just stuff like that. Like, that's pretty cool that company exists and that they found Butter and that they're using Butter to, kind of help solve some of their dev challenges.
And in terms of your experience of building out the technical platform and the business around it, what are some of the most interesting or unexpected or challenging lessons that you've learned in the process?
I don't know if scaling was unexpected. If you grow, that you're going to have to figure some things out. I don't think that's a shock to anybody, but just when you get into like the nitty gritty details of it, of just like, how do you solving some of those problems? How do you determine like when you need to stop working on new features and like halt all feature development? Like, we need to focus on scaling, which is not sexy. Customers don't see it for all intents and purposes. Like, you can put a lot of effort and time into building some new caching algorithm and cache purging strategy, but from your customer's perspective, like that doesn't really do anything for them. Like they can't do, it's not cool or sexy or whatever. But it could be tricky to like make those calls. Like, how far can you sort of push the current system before you really need to invest in platform itself and performance and that kind of thing? That's been interesting, to certainly kind of solve over time. I'm trying to think of some other challenging lessons. Yeah, like another lesson's been less on the tech side, but more just on the customer support side. So our customers tend to be developers. We're pretty heavily developer focused, and developers find Butter and they're the ones who kind of kick the tires and poke around and do the free trial and all that good stuff. So just thinking about like how best to support them and ensure that they can kind of go from point A to point B as fast as possible. So a lot of that's like building great documentation and supporting those docs. I think that's sort of like a golden rule that any kind of dev-focused company should adhere by. I think Stripe's probably one of the gold standards that people probably most commonly think about when it comes to like amazing documentation. There's some challenges with documentation and like scaling out to supporting more technology stacks. This one's sort of maybe unique to Butter, but because our core business is an API, we can technically work with like any technology stack out there and any and every, as long as it can, talk to an API, which is everything. And so, how do we best support that? Well, investing a lot of time in like building SDKs, starter projects, example projects where, even Java, you build out like a Java project that's kind of a minimal project, but it's like fully integrated with Butter and pulling content in some of the most common use cases and that kind of thing. That's been kind of a unique challenge. Certainly never faced that before. Building out SDKs, maintaining SDKs, and doing it across, I think we're up to like 23 or 24 tech stacks, like languages and frameworks at this point. So that's been a pretty interesting challenge as well.
And for people who are looking at CMS systems and trying to decide what fits best with their particular use cases and environment, what are the cases where Butter is the wrong choice?
Very simply, certainly one obvious case where Butter is the wrong choice is if you are super proficient with WordPress. So, the way I've kind of spoken about WordPress, I don't sound too fond of it. I'm just genuinely not, but I also don't have any experience with it, which is also why I'm not too fond of it. So, they kind of go hand in hand. If you are familiar with WordPress, then it's an amazing ecosystem and you could do all sorts of stuff with it. So, if you are starting with WordPress as your kind of core expertise and framework that and that you're most proficient with, then you should probably use WordPress, So that's certainly like one obvious use case. If you're just a really skilled WordPress, Drupal, there's other players beyond just WordPress, but if you have experience and skills with those frameworks and CMS systems, then, use those for sure. Some other kind of indicators when Butter is the wrong choice. If you don't have like any existing site and maybe aren't super opinionated on the underlying technology, like you're fine with PHP and MySQL and that kind of thing, then that could be a fine choice. And so there's lots of different companies. You have to think about it sort of from like a company/project perspective, is this a small startup that's mainly kind of marketing driven and they don't really even have an in-house developer perhaps, and you're just sort of trying to get any website up and running type of thing, if you don't have any in-house tech expertise and you're not working with a developer, Butter's not going to be a good choice for you. You're probably better off with like something that can be stood up with no developer involvement at all. Whether that's a Squarespace or a Wix site or something like that, or WordPress with like a off-the-shelf theme or something like that. So that could be another indicator. Another one would be if you're okay with like outsourcing all of your development to a WordPress agency that you have a good relationship, then could definitely go that route. That'd be okay. And I'd say finally, like if it's going to be sort of a standalone basic marketing site and you don't have any other tech stack or applications that need CMS capability, like you could argue for that WordPress is probably, or could be a better path to go down. It really kind of depends, right? There's a lot of nuance to this to determine if it's like the best fit for you or not. But those are some of the areas that come to mind. If I had to summarize again, it would be like, if you're proficient with WordPress or if your team works with it and knows it well, stick with it. Or if you don't have any developers at all on your team, Butter's not a good choice for you. You do need to have some development expertise to kind of integrate it and plug it into your site.
As you look to the near to medium term, what do you have planned for the future of the Butter CMS platform?
You mean beyond world domination? No, I'm just kidding. No, honestly, it's just kind of charting the same path that we've been doing. So continue to improve the product while refining it. So this has been an interesting challenge too, with like CMSs. This ties back to some of the previous questions. Like when it comes to CMS, there is no limit to like feature requests as far as what people have. There's millions of sites out there and people have set them up in infinitely different ways. They want to do different things with them and manage them in different ways. So there's all sorts of feature requests that come into play. That's certainly big, obviously a focus for us as a business to like improve the product, improve the capability of it. But it's really important to do that and challenging to do that while still like refining the product. So it's pretty, I won't say easy, but it's not super hard to like just keep building more features and more features and more features. What's not so easy is to like do that, but also to like potentially strip away features or to like refactor features into a more organized way so that the product itself stays simple and kind of refined and is easy to use. So, like just more capability, but easier to use. There's a lot of beauty in simplicity. It's a really hard thing to do. So that's a big focus for us for sure. But yeah, just in general, we want to be like the no-brainer choice. We want to be like the obvious choice to be the CMS for teams or companies who are using modern technology stacks. Modern being, I guess, kind of loosely defined. I mean, again, I'm a big Django fan, but it's even kind of old, I guess, by today's standards. But like anything not WordPress, honestly, you could be using .NET, Java, Django, Rails. You could be using all the new flashy Jamstack, Next.js, Angular, React, all that kind of stuff. We did touch on mobile, but there's mobile frameworks such as like Ionic, React Native, where you can use those frameworks to build theoretically one app in Ionic, for example, and then deploy that to Android, deploy that to iOS. You get dev efficiencies there. So if you want to use that and you need CMS capability, like we want Butter to be your go-to choice for adding CMS to that. Yeah, I should also mention we're continuing to grow and currently looking for a director of engineering as well. So someone to take over all of the challenges that I mentioned before and really kind of own that. We're actively looking for someone to do that as well. So pretty exciting time for us.
Are there any other aspects of headless CMSs and content management in general, or what you're doing at Butter specifically that we didn't discuss yet that you'd like to cover before we close out the show?
So if you go check out like our pricing, there's a lot of paid plans, but there is a free plan for personal use. If for anyone who wants to kick the tires and build out like a personal portfolio site, Butter's totally free, for that kind of usage. So if you want to just kind of see what it's like to work with Headless CMS for free and launch your personal site on it or something like that, you can absolutely use Butter for that for sure.
Well, for anybody who wants to get in touch with you and follow along with the work that you're doing, I'll have you add your preferred contact information to the show notes. And with that, I'll move us into the picks. And this week, I'm going to choose the TV show The Arrow that I've been watching recently. Definitely very interesting and pretty well put together show. Takes place in the DC universe. So yeah, definitely worth the watch if you're looking for something to keep you entertained during the winter. So with that, I'll pass it to you, Jake. Do you have any picks this week?
My pick is, I decided to kind of make a timely one, given the light of the unfortunate US hack. That sounds pretty darn serious, what I've read. There's a book called Ghost in the Wires. It's written by a guy called Kevin Mitnick, who is pretty well known. Well, if you're kind of in the security hacking space, he's like super well known, world renowned. And he tells his life story about all the different, how he got into hacking and at a young age and that kind of thing. And the different kind of organizations, government organizations that he was able to hack and how he did it. It's super insightful, super interesting book. Eventually, he goes on the run and that kind of thing. But the thing I took away from it was, as someone who's not a hacker or really into hacking or anything like that, is that you would think that on the outside, a lot of hacks happen through some super sophisticated technical means. And maybe they do, but this guy was one of the best, and he did it through social engineering. It seems like 99% of the time, which I found just to be fascinating. Basically just like tricking people at whatever government organization, whatever corporation, into just like basically giving him his passwords or running some command in their system to give him an opening to do it. So pretty interesting stuff. Again, just given the light of the recent hack in the US, might be one to check out.
Well, thank you very much for taking the time today to join me and share your experience of working in the content management space and building a business around that. It's definitely a very interesting and necessary problem domain. So thank you for all of the time and effort you've put into that. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Oh, thanks so much. It was a pleasure. Thanks for having me on. This was a real honor, a lot of fun, and you as well. Take care.
Thank you for listening. Don't forget to check out our other show, the Data Engineering Podcast, at dataengineeringpodcast.com for the latest on modern data management. And visit the site at pythonpodcast.com to subscribe to the show, sign up for the mailing list, and read the show notes. And if you've learned something or tried out a project from the show, then tell us about it. Email hosts@podcastinit.com with your story. To help other people find the show, please leave a review on iTunes and tell your friends and coworkers.